hand over for the introduction to Jona.
All right. So today I had the pleasure to introduce Henry Railo from the University of Turku in Finland, where he received his PhD in 2013 and is now an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology and Speech-Related Pathology. He has worked, among other topics, on blindsight and consciousness. And personally, I know him best from the work on conscious vision he has done with Mika Koivisto and Antti Ruonsuo, who also were his PhD supervisors. Using TMS and EEG, Henry and his colleagues have been able to show that participants can reliably report consciousness of a stimulus before the late P3B component that is often viewed as a marker of conscious access even arises. And recently, he has also done studies on TMS-induced blindsight, where the results seem to suggest that at least this type of blindsight is not really a case of truly unconscious vision. So, Henry, we are excited to hear you present your work and views on consciousness now.
Yeah. So thanks for the invitation. Happy to give you a talk about my stuff. The research I have been doing, for over 10 years now. I started it as part of my PhD studies and been continuing this line of research up to this day. And the topic is really general. How fast does conscious visual perception emerge and what is its functional significance? But basically, I want to talk about three more specific questions. First, like Jona said, I want to talk about the TMS-induced blindsight studies we have been doing. And I will argue that the capacity for unconscious visual processes to guide behavior is much more reduced and smaller than typically assumed, and much more limited. I'm going to talk about the electrophysiological correlates of conscious vision. So how fast do they appear, early or late? This is the classical debate in the neural correlates of conscious vision. There's theories that say that it happens really early, and then there's other group of theories that says that it's really late process. And there's actually quite a large discrepancy between these two views, and it's really difficult to gain empirical evidence that supports either one of these. And finally, I want to talk about what is the functional significance of conscious vision. So what does conscious vision and conscious visual perception enable us to do that unconscious visual processes cannot do? Firstly, I want to get a couple of definitions out of the way. So there's a really famous dichotomy about the concepts of consciousness and concepts related to conscious perception that suggests that we should divide the concept of conscious perception into two categories: phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness, or P consciousness and A consciousness. And in the beginning of my PhD studies, I used to support this because my supervisors supported this, and I thought it was really plausible dichotomy. But I want to say that I don't support this and endorse this division anymore. And I actually think that this is one of the reasons why we are at the moment at this kind of a deadlock with the interpretation of the neural correlates of consciousness. So typically, the argument goes that we can describe conscious perception and consciousness using functional terms by telling what consciousness does, and this would be access consciousness. But in addition to these functional descriptions, there's a feeling to consciousness. Something feels like something, what it is likeness of consciousness or the qualitative side of consciousness. And this would be the phenomenal consciousness term. And I actually think that both of these senses of the term phenomenal and access are part of consciousness. So you cannot really separate them. There is a feeling to consciousness that's the definitive feature of consciousness, but I would argue that that's not separate from the causal power it has to influence behavior or influence other brain processes. So I would say that conscious perception is participants' The way I measure conscious perception is that participant reports experiencing a sensory stimulus. So the report part would be the access consciousness, and experiencing part would be the phenomenal consciousness part. I will not talk about this really more, but if you want to know more about the theoretical background and the philosophical background I come from, this is the paper you should read. So we have argued here that science should be viewing consciousness as a physical process, just like science views. So consciousness should be approached using the same methodology as science approaches other physical phenomena. And we have so consciousness is a physical process that happens in the brain. It has a subjective phenomenological feeling to it, and we have the neural correlates of this process. And instead of saying correlate of consciousness, I would actually argue that this process that happens in the brain is the constitutive mechanism of consciousness. It is the physical process that is identical to the subjective point of view of, say, seeing blueberries. And this has some lower level constituents, atoms and molecules that make up neural circuits that in the end make the phenomenon we call consciousness. And there are certain etiological factors that lead to this brain state. These are the processes that take place before conscious perception, for example, that lead to this conscious percept. But also the conscious percept has causal power to influence behavior. For example, the subject might want to pick blueberries and eat them. But this is not, I'm not a philosopher, and I'm more into the empirical side and more into the experimental research. So I will leave this right now. The main work was done by Jussi Julka. But just so you know, I think this is an interesting framework you should look at if you are interested in the philosophical discussions and theoretical points of view into consciousness. Let's start with unconscious processing. So like I said, there's two frameworks that debate on conscious perception, the early and the late visual models. And they're very different frameworks, but what they actually agree on is that unconscious visual processing is enabled by feed-forward activity from sensory areas to higher cortical areas. So in the case of visual perception, that would be activity in the primary visual areas is serially transmitted to higher cortical areas. During this process, more and more complex receptive fields are activated, and eventually this leads to activation of motor areas, which then enable the subject to perform some action, button press or whatever. And the argument is that this is feed-forward serial process, so it's completely unconscious. It's a zombie mode of behaving. The participant and the individual human does something, but this happens completely without the contribution from conscious perception or consciousness. And investigating what types of processes mediate unconscious perception and unconscious perceptual processes is really important, because we want to see and we want to explain how conscious visual perception differs from these processes. So we want to show and find out what is special about consciousness. What does conscious vision enable us to do that we cannot do just by relying on unconscious visual processes? And I will, to some degree, disagree with this conclusion right here, in the sense that I will argue that actually the strength of this feed-forward process to drive behavior is much smaller than usually assumed. There's lots of evidence, at least seemingly lots of evidence, that feed-forward visual responses can guide behavior. One of the most well-known and maybe powerful demonstrations is that fastest reaction times seem to escape visual masking. So even when you have target stimulus and that's followed by a masking stimulus really fast, that corrupts conscious perception in the sense that the participant doesn't really see the target anymore, but they seem to be still able to press a button in response to the stimulus. And the argument goes that this kind of behavior relies on unconscious feed-forward processes. There's subliminal priming and related phenomenon which show that a stimulus that the participant reports not consciously perceiving can still influence their behavior, reaction times, or force choice responding, or things like this. And then there's blind sight, which is the phenomenon that patients with early visual cortical damage who have blind visual field regions are still able to process information from the blind visual field locations, despite the lesion and despite the fact that they say that they don't perceive anything from that area consciously. But are these behaviors really unconscious? It's really difficult to demonstrate that because it's really difficult to measure consciousness or unconsciousness accurately. For example, many studies have relied on yes-no dichotomous questions about conscious perception. You report yes when you saw it, or you report no when you didn't see a stimulus. But we know now that this is actually quite problematic, and what people tend to do is they will include into the no category, no conscious visual perception, they will include trials where they had a really faint experience of the stimulus. Other question relates to the feed-forward feature of this. So are these types of behaviors based on feed-forward activity? These phenomena I've listed here, with the possibly exception of blindsight, is that there is really no direct evidence that this is based on solely feed-forward neural activity. So this is for example, reaction time measurements are behavioral measurements, and they cannot directly show us that the behavioral response was based or initiated by a feed-forward process in the brain. And the third part, how often it works, refers to the fact that what is actually the capacity for these types of feed-forward and possibly unconscious processes to drive and influence our behavior. For example, in this study, where Van Rullen and Koch argued that they have evidence that feed-forward processes guide and trigger responses to visual targets, masked visual targets, they estimate that only 5% of responses fell into the category where it was feed-forward and unconscious. So that would mean that the majority of trials where there was a button press reaction time, it was actually based on conscious vision. And we could further argue that in this study, actually on those 5% of trials where they gained evidence for the feed-forward response, there was actually some faint residual conscious visual percept of the target. Here's an example of my recent study. Task was to discriminate the location of a Gabor patch, left visual field or right visual field, and then report subjective visibility using a 4-step scale. 0 means didn't see the target at all, and 3 means a really clear visual percept. And like in many studies previously, we observed that when the participants report that they didn't see the target at all, it was low threshold stimulus, they are still able to discriminate the location above chance levels, and quite clearly above chance levels. So that would be the y-axis here. Chance level is 50%, and the performance is something like 60% accurate. So the intuitive interpretation of this data is that this is unconscious. The participants report that they didn't see the target, but they still perform better than chance levels. So of course, it has to be unconscious, right? But the problem is that actually when we calculate sensitivity and criterion signal detection theoretical measures of conscious perception, we can see that the better the participants perceive the stimulus, the better their proportional correct answers on unconscious trials. And if we assume that the participant has zero sensitivity to discriminate consciously the stimulus or detect consciously the stimulus, they also have 50% proportion correct rate in the location discrimination task. So no evidence for unconscious processing. In other words, this type of data suggests that although we have a phenomenon that looks like unconscious perception, if we look at the details of the performance, it may actually not be completely unconscious perception, but it may show that participants have a bias in reporting things as unconscious that they actually may have a faint percept of. Usually, the idea about this type of forced choice performance on unconscious trials is attributed to visual pathways that bypass the early visual cortical areas. So there's the retinal LGN V1 pathway, the major visual pathway, but there's also smaller pathways through LGN or through superior colliculi or pulvinar that project to extrastriate areas, so other areas than V1. And of course, blind sight is the classical phenomenon that is usually assumed to demonstrate the existence of these pathways. So blind sight patients have a lesion to their V1, but they can still perform forced choice responses on the visual stimuli in the blind visual field locations. So the conclusion is that these smaller pathways must mediate their behavior. And they say that they cannot see the target. It's in the blind scotoma, so it has to be unconscious. The difficulty here, we have argued, is that these are patients, first of all, and many of these patients have had the lesion since their childhood. So there's lots of potential for neuroplasticity. So actually it could be argued, and there's evidence for the fact that their brains are actually different from neurologically healthy individuals' brains. But in any case, if we assume that behavior can unconsciously be guided by these minor visual pathways, we should be able to see blindsight-like behavior if we interfere with their perception using TMS. So we give magnetic pulses to the occipital cortex, V1 preferably, targeted by neuronavigation. And then we should see participants reporting that they don't see a stimulus at all, but they could still discriminate the location of the stimulus. They could discriminate the location, the color of the stimulus, or where it was moving, or orientation of the stimulus, things like this. And there were these types of reports, and there are these types of reports. But the problem is that these reports are often based on studies where people have used dichotomous visibility scales, so unseen or seen. Here's a study by Mika Koivisto from, I think this is from this year actually, where we had two conditions. We have a dichotomous awareness report condition and a perceptual awareness scale, so 4-step visibility report scenario. And proportion correct is again on y-axis. And when the participants use a dichotomous scale, we can see TMS blindsight-like behavior. So they report that they don't see the stimulus, but they are still above chance level accurate in reporting whether the target stimulus was vertical or horizontal. So here the task is to report the orientation of the line. And of course, trivially, when they see the stimulus, they're really good, almost perfect, proportion correct. However, if everything is kept constant, the TMS is the same, the stimulated area is the same, the stimuli are the same, but we ask awareness reports using a 4-step scale, and then we choose the lowest rating, it shows that the participants are at chance level in responding to reporting the orientation of the stimulus. So now we don't observe any TMS-induced blind sight phenomenon. And the interesting thing for future research will be to see how well research on blind sight patients actually will replicate this type of finding, because there are some findings on blind sight patients where the patients show blind sight with dichotomous rating scales, but when the authors used graded rating scales, there is no evidence for blind sight when blind sight is operationalized as the lowest, or when unconsciousness is operationalized as the lowest rating scale. But I think there's only 2 or 3 studies and very few patients in these studies. So I'd say the jury is still out, but I would assume actually that many of the patients will also show similar result. And in this study, again, if we correlate proportion correct on unconscious trials and look at how it correlates with D' sensitivity of conscious visual detection, we see again the positive correlation. And we see that if we assume 0 sensitivity to detect consciously the target, the participants are also at chance level in performing the orientation discrimination task. Recently, Ian Phillips has made the argument that in blind sight, actually, this type of bias in reporting conscious perception is what explains the apparent unconscious capacity, that it's not really unconscious, but it just seems unconscious because they have a bias in their reporting. I do want to say that for example, we and some other people have also gained some evidence that even when these graded scales are used, we do see some evidence for blindsight-like behavior with TMS. So here's a study from 2017, which is, I think, the first and possibly so far the only causal evidence that feed-forward visual activity is necessary for unconscious perceptual processes. So we gave TMS pulses to V1 at 2 different delays, 60 milliseconds delay, which is so in this case, the TMS pulse interference by the TMS pulse overlaps with the arrival of signals, visual signals, bottom-up activation to the V1. So we are interfering with the feed-forward activation of V1. And we don't see any unconscious, this is redundant target effect, but you can assume that it's like priming. So the task is to make a simple button press whenever the participants see a stimulus. They always report seeing just one stimulus, but sometimes there are 2 stimuli on the screen, but one of them have been suppressed from consciousness by TMS. And we know that in control conditions, when the second stimulus is suppressed from consciousness, they can actually decrease response times. This has been reported in blind sight patients and neurologically healthy controls. And we see that this is the case when the application of the TMS pulse is delayed by a few tenths of milliseconds. So we leave the feed-forward activation intact. The very initial bottom-up activation of V1, we leave that intact. And then we stimulate V1 and the participants, we suppress their conscious vision. The participants again say that there's only one stimulus and they're confident about their response. But there's a difference in reaction times. When there is 2 stimuli on the screen unknown to the participant, reaction times are faster than when there's only one stimulus. And this similar effect is not seen when we interfere with the feed-forward time window. I should note that this type of finding is also at odds with the blindsight literature. In blindsight, the lesion in V1 is permanent, so it should always block also feed-forward activity, not just feedback activity. So this type of dissociation is impossible to observe with patients. So it seems that these results really interesting, and they support the model that feed-forward activity is necessary for unconscious vision, but not sufficient for conscious vision. This seems to happen in neurologically healthy individuals, but this cannot be the explanation in blindsight patients. So in conclusions, I would like to argue that we have overestimated the strength of unconscious processing. So when we think about the capacity of unconscious stimuli to guide behavior, it is not so strong capacity as often thought. We don't have a zombie mode of behaving that is completely driven by unconscious feed-forward information, at least in most cases. This doesn't mean that I deny that there is no unconscious visual processing going on, that any unconscious visual contents could never guide visual behavior. I don't propose this. For example, I know that there are priming-like studies that show that stimuli that are not consciously perceived can influence reaction times, and I'm not doubting these. The point is that what I actually doubt is that people and individuals could make direct voluntary behavioral responses to visual stimuli just based on feed-forward activation. So now we move to the neural correlates of consciousness. So far I've discussed the feed-forward phase. And like I mentioned, there's two models. According to the early vision model, when recurrent interactions take place within the visual system and possibly parietal areas and visual areas, we have P-conscious perception, so phenomenally conscious perception. And at this time window, people can respond behaviorally, but these responses are based on the feed-forward activation. So according to this model, the P-conscious activation that takes place in the posterior areas is completely epiphenomenal. So it doesn't have any causal role in driving behavior. The process that is driving behavior is the feed-forward process that is assumed to be unconscious. And only later, when the recurrent interactions spread to frontal areas and cover the whole brain, then the models, both models, early vision model and late vision model, say that then conscious percepts can guide behavior. And based on the late vision theorists, this is the only consciousness that takes place here. So they would argue that the early recurrent interactions in the visual system in the posterior areas, they are not conscious, they are pre-conscious or unconscious. So here's the debate. How do we decide which one is correct? How do we know when consciousness takes place? Obviously, we can only ask participants to report after the conscious perception. We cannot record what they see subjectively and kind of verify posteriorly what they saw and was it consciousness or not. Before going into that and how I propose we could maybe solve this problem, I want to say a few words about the correlates of these so-called recurrent processes in the brain. So the early vision model argues that recurrent interactions between cortical areas in the visual system amplify neural activity, and this amplification leads to conscious perception. So we have a visual stimulus presented at time 0. Then there's the feed-forward peak of activity, which is the same for seen or unseen trials. And only after the feed-forward peak of activation, there's the amplification and recurrent processing. And this is the correlate of conscious visual perception. This is one of the first reports, and this was measured from V1 neuron. However, similar correlates are actually observed in frontal areas. So here's a neuron from the frontal eye fields, prefrontal cortical area, known to be involved in visual attention and saccadic eye movements. So you see basically exactly the same pattern of activation in the frontal eye field neurons. So this suggests that the recurrent interactions or the correlates of recurrent interactions are not just limited to posterior brain areas, but they also encompass prefrontal areas. And you could be thinking that maybe these are, the task in this study was to report target location using eye movement. So maybe these are just correlates of that feed-forward process. Maybe this is just activity that correlates with responding. So maybe this is the correlate of making an eye movement. That could be, that arguably would be an unconscious feed-forward driven eye movement to that location. But this doesn't work because the similar result has been found when eye movements are not used as the response feature. And actually, these are sensory neurons. So the correlation, the activation latency of these neurons doesn't correlate with the reaction time of the saccadic eye movements, but they are strictly time-locked to the visual stimulus. And these guys also record from motor neurons in frontal eye fields, and activity of these motor neurons do correlate with the reaction time to initiate saccadic eye movements. So you could make that argument for those neurons, but these are actually sensory neurons, so I don't think the evidence supports this conclusion. In humans, there's a similar correlate with a similar timing, basically, and similar topography. And this was first reported by Mika Koivisto and Antti Reponsua, my thesis supervisors. And there's the latest review by Joona about these correlates. And this correlate, so negative potential difference between consciously seen and unseen stimuli, are observed in the posterior brain areas about 200 milliseconds after stimulus onset. And this is often interpreted as the correlate of P-conscious processes. This is by Renate Rutikus study. I think Talis Bachmann was also part of this, and Jan Aro. So this is often interpreted as a correlate of P-consciousness. So it's taken to support the early vision model. These are phenomenally conscious activations, which, based on the argument, are not, or based on the theory, do not have capacity to guide behavior, because behavior would be guided by access conscious processes. So how do we know? I will make the argument that actually visual awareness negativity and the early correlates of conscious vision are not just P-conscious, but they also have capacity to guide behavior. And one of the reasons for this is our study published in 2015. Again, the paradigm is really simple fixation, and then we have a target on right or left visual field, and then we interfere with the processing of this stimulus using V1 TMS. So TMS pulses to V1, and we only ask for speeded visibility reports. So we ask, say, participants, when you see the stimulus, press the button as fast as possible. But when you don't see the stimulus, don't press the button. So it's a go, no-go task, essentially. And if feed-forward visual processes would have the capacity to guide behavior unconscious, based on unconscious stimuli, we should see that when people report that they didn't see the stimulus, or we would assume that we see kind of these false alarms where people respond to the stimulus even when they don't see it, but we don't actually observe this type of effect. But we see that people start to press button sorry, there was two tasks actually here. This is incorrect. So the first one is a speeded visibility report. Press a button, no-go task, go, no-go task, and then the second one is a visibility rating. So if there would be unconscious feed-forward processes, we should observe that people press the button reflexively and then later report that they didn't see anything. But this doesn't really happen. And people only press the button in the go, no-go task when they also report seeing the stimulus. And reaction times are really fast for these go, no-go reports. The peak is before 300 milliseconds, median reaction times before shorter than 300 milliseconds. And these reaction times, the fastest reaction times, take place before the correlate of the late vision model, but they take place after the early correlates, which kind of suggests that if there is some process in the brain that is causally related to the button press, of course, these processes have to take place before the actual button press. And these are all consciousness reports. So this kind of rules out that the later correlate would be a correlate of conscious perception, because it takes place after they report conscious perception of the target. And we're left with visual awareness negativity, which takes place before the reaction times. Here's an older example, a visual masking study. They have a target followed by a visual mask, and then they vary the delay between the target and the mask. And the closer the mask stimulus is temporally to the target stimulus, the stronger the masking effect. So when it's just right after the target, behavioral accuracy is almost 50%. And as they start to increase the delay of the mask, people start to behave better. They are better at the discrimination. I think this was they had a target group. There were photographs, and then there's a target category and distractors. So the bigger the delay, the better they discriminate the target. And as the delay is increased, also visual awareness negativity increases. So when the SOA between target and mask is 6 milliseconds, there's really no visual awareness negativity, but it starts to increase bit by bit. And the crazy thing is that when they look at the correlation between basically visual awareness negativity here and behavioral accuracy, it's almost perfect. So again, this is really strong evidence, I would argue, for the view that visual awareness negativity and the brain processes that take place in this time window do have the capacity to guide behaviors, and they are not just P-conscious effects. I think this is the final slide. Just want to kind of introduce a really interesting series of studies that have been run. Actually, I don't remember the name. I think it's the Stanford. Don't remember the name of the PI, but they have developed this compelled reaction time task, which goes so that they have a fixation cross or fixation dot, and the participant's task is to make an anti-saccade to a target stimulus. And what they wanted to do research on, what they wanted to study is how fast can people make the decision on where to make the saccades based on the cue. And this is really difficult to do normally, because usually you would have a fixation point, and then you have the onset of the target, and then people have to do the anti-saccade, which means that they do a saccade in the opposite direction than the target. This is a really difficult process because you kind of have to override your reflexive exogenously directed behavior. Usually you are confounded by the fact that it takes time to initiate the saccade. So it's really difficult to determine what is the time you need to make this type of decision that now I need to make the saccade to the opposite direction. So what they do is they have a fixation point, and when the fixation point disappears, the participants have to make a saccade, either to the left or right visual field. And then they introduce the cue stimulus at variable delays after the fixation cross has been turned off. So the participants basically have to make a saccade to either direction, and then at some point they will be told where is the correct location. And this enables the calculation of processing time instead of reaction time. And they show that first, when you introduce the target really fast after the fixation has turned off, people make exogenously driven saccades. So they make incorrect saccades. They saccade to the target, which is an incorrect response. But when you delay the onset of the cue a bit to somewhere around 150 milliseconds after the fixation offset, then you can actually see that the participants will start to make correct saccades, voluntarily guided saccades to the correct location opposite to the target. And the three lines here are three different stimulus strengths. So the green would be really clearly visible stimulus. And you can see here that first, when they have 100 milliseconds processing time, they make exogenously driven saccades. But right after 150 milliseconds processing time, they can actually make a voluntary decision where they override their exogenous reflexive behavior and saccade to the opposite direction. This is really fast, and I think this is just, there's no time to go into detail into these, but I think this supports the fact that conscious decisions and voluntary decisions that are used in guiding our behavior take place really fast in the brain. And these responses are not, these early visual correlates are not just unconscious feed-forward processes. That's all basically. So I have argued that the early correlates are not solely localized to occipital cortex. They are already kind of this brain-wide activity pattern taking place at this point. And these early correlates do have the power to influence behavior. So they are not just correlates of phenomenal consciousness, but they are also correlates of access consciousness. And I have argued that humans' capacity to make direct manual behavioral responses to visual stimuli based on the visual stimuli they do not consciously perceive is very limited, if it even exists. And I would make the argument that this type of view reconciles the classic early and late models, because it's kind of a hybrid between them. We say that that conscious visual perception takes place early, but it is the access consciousness, if you want to use that term. It is access conscious vision already at that point. Thank you very much.